Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is in Finland today, leading the U.S. delegation to the Arctic Council. Like his boss, he's still focused squarely on China and didn't miss an opportunity to take a direct swipe at Beijing, even when it came to the Arctic.
China's pattern of aggressive behavior elsewhere should inform what we do and how it might treat the Arctic.
Welcome to our political roundtable. Jeannie Zaino here in New York, who is a senior advisor to applied economics, and Chris Wilson, who served as director of research for Ted Cruz's 2016 presidential campaign, coming to today from Oklahoma City. So, Chris, let's start with you, and let's talk about the politics of what's going on with this trade dispute that seems to be escalating at the moment. How does this play for the Republican base of Donald Trump?
Well, I think most Republicans are free traders first, but they're also fair traders, and they have taken a look and given the president time to see what would be the occurrences or what would be the outcome of his strong stances on trade. And I think right now the reaction is pretty good. His approval rating with Republicans hovers in the high 80s to low 90% ratio, and now you see his numbers on approval of the economy reaching 55%. And I think that is a reflection of the president is right now succeeding on the economy. You've got the unemployment rate at the lowest it's been since we put a man into space, and you've got more jobs available than people are looking for jobs. And most importantly, I think, is wages. When you look at wages, when they rose under Obama, they typically rose with supervisors and management class, whereas right now you've got the highest increase of wages is happening at the worker class, and that's positive for the president. It's positive for his reelection chances, and it's playing well with his base, but it's also playing well with swing voters and the suburban moms that, frankly, we Republicans lost pretty heavily in 2018 is the key to success in 2020.
So, Jeannie, what about it? Chris says basically it's not about China, it's about the economy. It's about wages. Does he have a real strong point?
You know, the economy is good, and the problem for the president, though, has to do with those farmers who Bernie Sanders and other Democrats are out talking to in Iowa. These are the people who have suffered tremendously under this trade war. So you look, you've seen what was $25–30 billion has been cut now to about $12 to $15 billion. Farmers are facing a catastrophe in these areas, and the president, to win, goes right through the Midwest. That's why he's got to be very concerned about the impact of this trade war on the very voters he depends on. So those are big questions for the president. And my question is, how are Democrats going to respond? Because I think we've still seen a lukewarm response from Democrats who have been a bit timid to take on the president with this trade war.
I want to go back to Chris, but first, just to touch on something. Is that why Vice President Joe Biden, went out and said basically China's not that big a deal? Is that basically to try to appeal to the farmers, saying, I'll make sure that you can sell your stuff?
Absolutely. And he is absolutely right. You have to appeal to those farmers, and you have to tell them you are not going to let those farms go into foreclosure. You look at one issue, soybeans, dramatic impact. Joe Biden is smart to take that on, and I think other Democrats need to follow. And I give Amy Klobuchar credit because she has been the one who has been out there with support of the farmers doing that.
So, Chris, what about that? I mean, the farmers have been remarkably patient, I think, thus far with the President of the United States, but they are really hurting. As you know, farm incomes are really down substantially. How long can that patience last?
It's a good question, and I agree with most of what Gene's had to say. I think it's a matter of whether or not the farm economy is able to recover in probably the next 12 to 18 months as to how that impacts November of 2020. And right now, I believe most farmers are giving the president the benefit of the doubt. They're kind of waiting it out. They're hurting, but at the same time, you didn't see the farm districts vote heavily against Republicans in 2018, and I think some Republicans were really concerned about that. Most of those farm districts elected their Republican members of Congress or stayed with their incumbents. And so what happens between now and 2020? And I think that may be why you see the president escalating the trade war right now, because he knows he has a time frame in which he's got to be able to win this and make sure that he's able to get those farm economies back on track.
And in the meantime, Chris, what about the Rust Belt? Because there's talk that actually he's more vulnerable. He won a lot of that, including my home state of Michigan, but not by a lot. And there's talk that particularly Joe Biden could hurt him in some of those states.
Well, it's too early to see what those districts come out to. But right now, if it comes down to the economy, I think you've got to look at the Rust Belt as areas that are really strong for the president. It's interesting. There's the dichotomy that exists between his approval on the economy and his overall approval ratio, and that's what we're looking at really from a 2020 standpoint. Is how do they cast their ballot? Is it about the economy, which is what we have seen in the past and the most likely outcome, or is it more personality driven? And it is about the economy. I think right now you've got to look at the president as the favorite in those Rust Belt states. Is he he able to come out and win Michigan again like he did in 2016? Well, I like his chance against Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. I think against Joe Biden, it becomes a little bit different race. But it's, the thing about Joe Biden is I would disagree with his comments on China. I think that was actually a gaffe, and he didn't mean to say what he actually said. Now, we could probably spend an entire show talking about that. But the challenge with Biden is as long as he kind of stays out of the camera and doesn't fall into his former gaffe-prone approaches to his last two presidential campaigns, yeah, he's a strong candidate. But he just got in a couple of weeks ago, and we'll have to see how long he's able to maintain any discipline around that candidacy.
So, Jeannie, I noticed that Chris very carefully said Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren about places like Michigan and Ohio. But Biden's a different case, as a practical matter. Who can make a case, if anyone, to Michigan, to Ohio, to Wisconsin? The president promised you a lot in 2016. You didn't get it.
I think Joe Biden right now is the person to make that case. Again, I would also point to the senator from Colorado who just got into the race, also Amy Klobuchar. There are people running up that middle aisle following Joe Biden at this point. And I would say if we want a sign that the president is nervous about the economy, that explains his meeting with Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and the $2 trillion on infrastructure. Why is he making agreements with the Democrats on these things? Because he knows he has to deliver something to the American people, particularly workers on the ground. There's no other reason that Trump is making a deal with the Democrats on infrastructure. He's worried the economy doesn't stand up by November 2020 so he can win this election.
He says he's making a deal. We'll see whether it actually does. But isn't that a strong point, Chris? Actually, is the president really thinking there could be fiscal stimulus that can replace, because the tax cuts are going off, essentially, if we get $2 trillion in work projects, that could really help the economy a lot before 2020.
Well, we'll see. I mean, I think it's the devil's in the details on that, and I think it is. I kind of look at his meeting with the Democrats as a little bit different than specifically about infrastructure. I think it's more about him getting a few wins and showing that he can work with Democrats in Congress, and he needs that. But I got to tell you, from a standpoint of anybody competing with him on the economy, I think it's going to be really tough to do with the way this economy is humming right now. And we'll see whether it's sustained. But I mean, there have been how many reports we had over the course of the last 18 months that the economy is strong now, but it's about to collapse, and it continues to hum along, and we continue to have more jobs created, and we continue to see the unemployment rate drop. So I feel really good about his ability, and we see his approval rating continue to move up, and that to me politically is probably the most important aspect of that.
Jeannie,
you see that 55% is strong.
Yeah, Jeannie, don't you have to sort of agree with Chris on this? I mean, if, and it's a big if the economy is growing something like 3%, and we've got wage gains, 3.2, 3.4, and real wage gains, when you take account of inflation with it, it's going to be awfully hard for any Democrat to take the White House. Don't you agree, Jeannie?
I do agree on that, and I would tell you that's the president's biggest concern. That's why his biggest fight is right now with the Fed. He is deeply concerned that this isn't going to sustain. And I'll tell you the other issue he has, health care. Democrats need to run on health care, and they need to run on inequality, because as good as the economy is, it hasn't filtered down. People on Main Street are not feeling it in the way the president and other Republicans say they should be. And so those things together, I think, are things the president has to tackle.
Well, it's interesting. Does the president have to tackle health care again? You notice we haven't heard much about repealing Obamacare lately. We heard a lot about that in the early days, Chris. Is that really his recognition that it didn't work so well in the off-year election?
Well, no, he did just bring it up a few weeks ago. It was kind of a shock to Republicans when he said we're going to see Republicans push a bill, and it's going to be stronger on pre-existing conditions than anything that Obamacare had done. And I think this is
after the election. After the election, we'll tell you.
Yeah, it was after the election. Right. That's right.
Yeah, it's important.
A couple months after the election. Yeah, that's right. A few of my clients wished it would have been a few weeks sooner, but that's all right. It was everybody kind of has to run on their own on that anyway when it comes to health care. But there's clearly something has to be done there, because you do see a lot of states collapsing under the weight of the Obamacare mandates that they're not able to fund. And so as you see Obamacare start to dissolve just because of its own structure there, I do think Republicans are going to be smart and really have to come forward with another plan. But I would dispute a little bit about the idea that people on Main Street are not feeling this economy. And again, when you see the numbers go up to 55% approval, you see the fact that wages are rising not just at the management level, but at the worker level, at a higher level than we ever saw under Obama or under any past president really for the last 20 years, and unemployment at the lowest it's been in 50 years, it's tough to make an argument that this isn't being felt at all levels.
Okay, if the economy can keep going. So thanks very much to Jeannie Zaino here in New York and Chris Wilson out in Oklahoma City.